The dust in dry willow had a taste. It was coppery and fine, the kind that settled on your tongue and in the folds of your clothes and never quite left. It rose with the morning sun, danced in the heat of midday, and settled into a soft red blanket as the evening cooled. Eliza Hart knew its taste better than she knew the taste of peace. She had come to the New Mexico territory seeking a life she could choose, not one that had been chosen for her by tragedy, the smallpox that had taken her husband. A good and steady man had also scoured her world clean, leaving behind an emptiness as vast as the plains. Here in this town clinging to a stagecoach trail, life was hard, but it was hers. At 24, she was the town's unofficial teacher and nurse, her small adobe house a sanctuary for children learning their letters and men with cuts, fevers, or too much whiskey in them. Her hands, once soft, were now deft with bandages and chalk dust. She had a straight way of speaking that some found blunt, but a well of compassion that most everyone had drawn from at one time or another. Her goal was simple: a proper schoolhouse, a small clinic, and a life stitched together with purpose instead of grief. The heat of the late afternoon pressed down when the boy came running, his bare feet kicking up puffs of that ever-present dust. He was one of the Martinez children, his face streaked with dirt and panic. His mother, Sophia, was having her baby, and it was coming too fast. Eliza grabbed her worn leather bag, its contents a jumble of clean rags, laudanum, and dried herbs. She gave the boy a reassuring nod and followed him out of town, her steps quick and measured. The trail to the Martinez homestead wound through a landscape of sagebrush and sandstone. The land was stark, beautiful in its own fierce way, with canyons that cut deep into the earth like old wounds. From a high ridge, hidden among the pinon and juniper, Atsidi Nez watched her go. He was a man made of this land, his movements as quiet as a shadow, his eyes missing nothing. He knew the woman, the one they called the teacher. He had seen her kindness before, small acts that went unnoticed by most. He lived by the principle of Hozo, the pursuit of balance and harmony in a world that was increasingly out of balance. He had his own history with the men who wore badges and the bounty hunters who followed them, a history written in conflict and loss. His purpose was carved into his soul to protect his family, his land, and the dignity of the people, the Dean. Today, he was tracking his young cousin, Abel, who had gone searching for wild roots and had not returned when expected. Atsidi's gaze swept the terrain below, and he saw a flicker of movement near a dry wash. It was not the teacher. It was Abel, lying awkwardly at the base of a rock slide, and the teacher was changing her course, heading directly for him. Eliza reached the boy and knelt. His leg was twisted at a bad angle, a clean break of the bone showing white through the torn flesh of his trousers. He was frightened, his dark eyes wide with pain. Eliza spoke to him in a low, calm voice, her Spanish gentle. She told him her name, that she was here to help. He flinched when she touched his leg, but her hands were surprisingly strong and steady. From her bag, she took splints and linen. She worked with a focused grace, cleansing the wound as best she could and setting the bone with a swift, practiced motion that made the boy cry out once, a sharp yelp of pain. From his vantage point, Atsidi watched, his body tense. He could have been down there in moments, but he held back. He saw the woman's face. There was no disgust in it, no fear of the boy's blood or his brown skin. There was only concentration and a deep, quiet empathy. She gave the boy a small sip of water from her canteen, then a few drops of the laudanum to dull the pain. She finished her work, the leg now splinted and secure. She promised the boy she would send his father back for him as soon as she delivered the new baby. As she stood, she looked up, her eyes scanning the high ridges as if she felt his gaze upon her. Their eyes did not meet. He had already melted back into the landscape, a ghost among the ancient stones. But he had seen. He had noted her courage, her skill, In a world where his people were treated as less than human, this act of simple, decent humanity was a rare and powerful thing. He would not forget it. By the time Eliza reached the Martinez homestead, the sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and violet. Sophia's labor was hard, but with Eliza's help. A healthy baby girl entered the world with a lusty cry just as twilight settled. The family's joy was a bright light in the gathering dark. Eliza stayed long enough to ensure mother and child were stable, then started her journey back to Dry Willow, her heart a little lighter. The mood in town had shifted. The air was thick not just with dust, but with anger. A knot of men stood in front of the saloon, their voices low and sharp. Eliza saw the glow first, a malevolent orange against the deep blue of the night sky, coming from the direction of the Martinez place. Then she heard the news. The Martinez's barn had been set on fire, burned to the ground. A total loss. Deputy Boone, a man whose authority came more from the size of his gut and the loudness of his voice than from any sense of justice, was holding court. It was Indians, he declared, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Had to be, sneaking around, causing trouble. Probably the same ones that broke that boy's leg. Eliza's blood ran cold. She knew Abel had fallen. She saw the lie taking root, twisting the day's events into something ugly and false. Across the street, standing on the porch of his mercantile, was Silas Kincaid. He was a merchant, a contractor for the new railroad, a man who collected power the way others collected coins. He watched the scene with a placid expression, a slight smile playing on his lips. He was stoking the flames of fear as surely as his men had stoked the flames that consumed the barn. He wanted the land in the Salt Cedar Valley, land the Martinez family and Atsidis people had lived on for generations. He wanted the water and the whisper of copper in the soil, and he would use any tool to get it, including prejudice and violence. Eliza saw it all with a terrible clarity. This was the justice of the powerful, the law of the strong. To be safe here meant to be silent, to look away. But she had looked into Abel's frightened eyes. She had held Sophia's newborn daughter. She could not unsee what she had seen. The idea of the school, of a quiet, chosen life, suddenly felt fragile, a dream that could be burned down as easily as a barn. Later that night, she sat on the small porch of her home, the desert air cool on her skin. The scent of burned wood still lingered, a bitter perfume. She felt a deep weariness settle into her bones. The world was so full of needless cruelty. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the chirping of the crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. When she opened them again, she saw it. On the top step, where it had not been a moment before, sat a small pouch made of soft, tanned deer hide. It was stitched with sinew and decorated with a simple, elegant pattern. It was Dine. Her heart beat a little faster. She looked out into the darkness, but there was no one there. Hesitantly, she picked it up. The pouch was cool to the touch. She loosened the drawstring and a pungent, earthy smell rose to meet her, the scent of healing herbs meant for burns. Thank you. Eliza stood there for a long time, the pouch clutched in her hand. It was not a threat, but a connection made in silence. It was a recognition of her act, a secret shared between her and someone she had never met. She did not feel fear. She felt a profound and unsettling curiosity. In a town simmering with suspicion and hatred, someone had chosen to answer kindness with kindness. And in the vast, lonely darkness of the New Mexico night, that felt like a flicker of hope, a small, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. The herb pouch sat on Eliza's small kitchen table, a silent testament in a town that was growing louder by the day. The whispers about the Martinez fire had solidified into a hard, ugly certainty for most folks in Dry Willow. It was the Navajo. Deputy Boone made sure of it, his voice booming from the saloon porch, painting pictures of savage raids for any man who would buy him a whiskey. 3 days after the fire, Silas Kincaid made his move. He tacked a large notice to the board outside his mercantile. It was an official-looking document, full of legal words and bearing a crisp territorial seal. It announced, in no uncertain terms, that the water rights for the entire Salt Cedar Valley had been legally transferred to his new enterprise, the Dry Willow Land and Copper Company. It also included a map, showing new boundary markers that pushed the Martinez homestead and the winter grounds of the Dine into territory now owned by Kincaid. A crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. The document was a death sentence in this arid land. Without access to the creek in Salt Cedar, their small ranches would wither, their cattle would die. Kincaid stood on his porch, radiating an aura of calm reason. "This is progress, friends," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "The railroad needs a steady supply of copper, and I aim to provide it. This brings jobs. It brings stability. Of course, I will compensate those who are displaced. A fair price, naturally." Someone in the crowd muttered, "What's a fair price for your whole life?" Kincaid's eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. "The law is the law. The boundaries are clear." Then came the second notice, tacked up by Deputy Boone himself. It was a wanted poster, crude but effective. It offered a $50 reward for the capture of a Navajo warrior named Atsidi Nez, wanted for questioning in the matter of the Martinez fire and for threatening the peace of the territory. Eliza stood at the edge of the crowd, her stomach churning. She had visited the Martinez family that morning. Abel's leg was beginning to heal. The boy's initial fear replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. He had told her stories he had heard of Atsidi Nez, a leader among his people, a man known for his wisdom, not his recklessness. The pieces fit together with a sickening click. The fire was a pretext. The land grab was the goal, and Atsidi Nez was the scapegoat. That evening, Mrs. Lujan, the midwife, came to Eliza's house carrying a basket of freshly baked tortillas. She was a woman whose face was a roadmap of a long and eventful life, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. "Fools," she said, setting the basket down with a thump. "They believe the paper with the fancy stamp, but they do not believe their own eyes." Kincaid smiles like a saint, and Boone puffs up like a toad in the sun, and the whole town lines up to be kicked. "What can anyone do?" Eliza asked, her voice quiet. "The document looks official." "Official does not mean true. Mrs." Lujan retorted, her hands on her hips. "Since when does a fox guard the henhouse? That man Kincaid would steal the pennies off a dead man's eyes and call it a business expense." They talked for an hour, their conversation a small island of sanity in a town swept up in a tide of suspicion. After Mrs. Lujan left, Eliza felt a renewed sense of unease. The town was no longer just a place of hardship. It felt dangerous. She double-checked the lock on her door, a habit she had not bothered with before. The next morning, she knew something was wrong the moment she stepped inside her home after her morning walk. The air was different. A book was crooked on the shelf. The lid on her sewing basket was slightly askew, with a growing sense of dread. She went to the small wooden chest where she kept her papers. It had been opened. She frantically searched through its contents. Nothing seemed to be missing. Then she realized what the intruder had been looking for, her medical logbook. It lay at the bottom of the chest, right where she had left it. She opened it to the most recent entry. Abel Martinez, age 14. Compound fracture of the left tibia. Injury consistent with a fall from a rock outcropping. Treated at 2 in the afternoon, near the dry wash west of his family's homestead. The entry was an alibi. It placed Abel, and by extension the Dine he was with, far from the Martinez homestead at the time Deputy Boone claimed they were lurking about, preparing to set the fire. Someone knew this logbook existed, and they had tried to take it. The failed attempt was a chilling message. They knew what she knew, and they wanted her to be silent. The choice was laid bare before her. She could burn the logbook, forget what she had seen, and retreat into the quiet, safe life she had craved. She could teach her students, tend to the sick, and pretend the world was just and fair. Or she could stand up, speak the truth, and face the consequences. She thought of her late husband, a man of quiet principle. What would he have done? She thought of the deerskin pouch, a silent appeal to a shared humanity. Her decision felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. She could not live with the silence. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and a bottle of ink. Her handwriting was clear and strong. She began to write a petition to the county magistrate. It detailed the sudden and suspicious nature of Kincaid's claim, the convenient timing of the fire, and the contradictory evidence regarding the presence of the Navajo. It did not make accusations. It simply asked for an official and impartial investigation. She took it to Mrs. Lujan first, who signed it with a flourish. "It is probably useless," the old woman said, "but it is better to shout in the wind than to say nothing at all." Getting other signatures was harder. Some people shuffled their feet and refused to meet her eyes. Others whispered their support but were too afraid to put their names on paper. But she found a few. A handful of Mexican families who knew the sting of injustice. A couple of small ranchers who saw their own ruin in Kincaid's map. Even old man Crowley, the saloon keeper, surprised her. He read the petition twice. His rheumy eyes narrowed. "Kincaid pays his bills on time," he grumbled. "But a man who chokes off the water chokes off everyone. It is bad for business." He scrawled his name at the bottom of the list, with a dozen signatures. Eliza rode the stagecoach to the county seat. The hearing was a farce. The magistrate, a man who clearly had business dealings with Kincaid, glanced at her petition with open boredom. Kincaid's lawyer produced a stack of papers, all stamped and sealed, and the matter was dismissed in less than 15 minutes. Eliza was left standing on the courthouse steps, the useless petition in her hand, the taste of defeat as bitter as alkali dust. The journey back to Dry Willow was quiet and lonely. The stagecoach left her at the trail turnoff as the sun began to set, leaving her with a 2-mile walk back to town. The canyon walls rose up around her, their red rock glowing in the fading light. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her own boots on the gravelly path. It happened without warning. 2 men stepped out from behind a cluster of boulders. They were rough-looking, men she recognized as Kincaid's hired hands. They did not say a word. One of them grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. The other reached for the satchel that held her logbook. She fought back, twisting and kicking, but it was hopeless. They were too strong. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. They were not just going to take the book. She could see it in their eyes. Then, from the shadows above, something moved. It was a blur of motion, silent and impossibly fast. A figure dropped from the canyon rim, landing as softly as a cat. One of the men grunted and crumpled to the ground, a dark shape at his feet having struck his head. The second man turned, his hand reaching for a pistol, but he was too slow. The rescuer moved with a fluid, deadly grace, disarming him and sending him sprawling with a series of precise strikes. The entire encounter was over in seconds. The fallen men scrambled to their feet and fled down the canyon, disappearing into the twilight. Eliza was left standing there, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her rescuer stood a few feet away, a silhouette against the darkening sky. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple cotton shirt. He did not speak. He simply watched her, making sure she was unharmed. As he turned his head slightly, the last rays of sunlight caught the glint of silver at his throat. It was a necklace, intricately carved, with a single piece of polished turquoise at its center. It was a piece of Dine craftsmanship, beautiful and distinctive. In that moment, she knew. This was the man who had left the herbs on her porch. This was Atsidi Nez. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, and then he was gone, melting back into the rocks and shadows as silently as he had appeared. Eliza stood alone in the canyon, the silence rushing back in. She was no longer just a witness to injustice. She was a target, and she had a protector she had never met, a man with a price on his head, bound to her by a thread of shared humanity in the vast, dangerous landscape of the West. The days that followed the canyon attack were quiet, but it was a coiled, watchful quiet. Eliza moved through her routines with a heightened awareness, every shadow seeming to hold a threat, every unfamiliar face a potential enemy. The image of the silver necklace was burned into her mind, a symbol of a strange and dangerous alliance she had not chosen but could not deny. The silence from Kincaid and Boone was more unnerving than their open hostility. The connection was made real again a week later. It was Abel Martinez who came for her, his limp now barely noticeable. He arrived at her door just after dawn, his young face serious. He spoke in a low, urgent tone. A sickness had taken hold in the Dine camp, a fever that burned hot and left its victims weak and trembling. Atsidi Nez's sister, Nali Yazi, was gravely ill. They needed help. They were asking for her. Eliza hesitated for only a moment. To go was to cross a line, to openly associate with the people the town had branded as enemies, but to refuse was to deny the very core of her being. She packed her bag with quinine, dried willow bark, and cool cloths. Abel led her away from the town, not along the main trails, but through a series of winding arroyos and hidden paths she never knew existed. The Dine camp was nestled in a hidden cove, sheltered by sheer sandstone cliffs. It was a place of quiet dignity, with hogans built of earth and juniper. The people watched her arrival with wary, unreadable expressions. She was an outsider, a white woman, and her presence was a risk to them all. Atsidi Nez met her at the edge of the camp. He was not the fleeting shadow from the canyon, but a man of flesh and blood. His presence commanding. He wore the silver necklace. His gaze was direct and intense, searching her face for something she could not name. He gave a curt nod. "She is in here." Nali Yazi lay on a sheepskin pallet inside a hogan, her body shaking with chills despite the heat. Her skin was hot to the touch. It was malaria, the swamp fever, fierce and unforgiving. Eliza knelt beside her and began her work, her movements calm and efficient. She coaxed a dose of quinine mixed with water between the woman's dry lips and began sponging her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. Atsidi stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched every move she made, his eyes missing nothing. The tension in the small space was thick enough to touch. Eliza could feel his scrutiny, a weight on her shoulders. Finally, she could stand it no longer. "You do not need to look at me like I am a bear trap," she said, her voice even, her eyes not leaving her patient. There was a long pause. When he spoke, his voice was a low rumble. "I was only counting your stitches. It is rare to see a stranger who sews so well." She glanced at the neat line of sutures she had put in a man's arm the day before, a task she had performed almost without thought. A small smile touched her lips. The tension eased, replaced by a fragile thread of mutual respect. He was not just watching her, he was seeing her. She stayed for 3 days. She nursed Nali through the worst of the fever, sleeping on a blanket near the door and sharing the family's simple meals of corn and mutton. She learned that Nali was a weaver, her hands as skilled with yarn and loom as Eliza's were with needle and thread. Through Nali's weak but persistent words, and Atsidi's quiet, infrequent translations, a fragile bridge was built. While Eliza was away, Mrs. Lujan was busy. The old midwife had a network of cousins and godchildren that spanned the territory. She put her ear to the ground and listened. She visited the county seat again, not with a petition, but with a basket of empanadas for a chatty clerk in the land office. She learned that the territorial seal on Kincaid's document was genuine, purchased legally. But the signature of the land commissioner, a man named Patterson, looked wrong to her. She had seen his signature on her own small deed. This one, she told Eliza upon her return, was too perfect, too neat. A man who signs papers all day does not have a hand so steady. She declared, "This is the signature of a forger, not a bureaucrat." The idea took root, a real seal on a forged document. It was a clever deception. They began to collect stories, quiet testimonies from people who had been threatened or pushed off their land by Kincaid in the past. It was a dangerous task, building a case one whispered word at a time. Meanwhile, Abel, emboldened by a desire to help the man who had protected Eliza, undertook his own mission. He knew Deputy Boone used an old shed behind the saloon as a storeroom. One night, slipping through the darkness, he jimmied the lock. Inside, tucked away beneath a pile of dusty burlap sacks, he found what he was looking for, a half-empty canister of gunpowder and a bundle of oily rags, the same kind used for starting stubborn fires. It was the proof they needed, the hidden link between the lawman and the arson. As the human conflict simmered, the land itself grew harsher. The sky remained a pitiless, empty blue. The creek in Salt Cedar shrank, its flow dwindling to a trickle. The grass on the plains turned brown and brittle. The drought, which had been a quiet worry, became a looming disaster. Ranchers pushed their herds further and further in search of water and forage. One sweltering afternoon, a herd of thirsty cattle, driven by two angry ranchers, broke through a makeshift fence and trampled onto the Dane grazing grounds. Heading for the last deep pool in the creek, a group of young Navajo warriors, their patience worn thin, rode out to meet them, their faces set and grim. Eliza, who had been visiting Nali to check on her recovery, saw the confrontation brewing from a distance. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The ranchers had rifles. The Dine had bows and arrows and a deep, righteous anger. Before a shot could be fired or an arrow let fly, Atsidi appeared. He rode between the two groups, his horse calm, his own body relaxed but alert. He held up a single, empty hand, a universal sign of peace. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He spoke, his voice carrying in the still, hot air. He spoke to the ranchers in clear, unaccented English. He acknowledged their desperation, the thirst of their animals. Then he pointed to the trampled corn stalks and the fouled water of the pool. He spoke of balance, of sharing a resource that belonged to no single man but to the land itself. He made an offer. The cattle could drink, a few at a time. His people would help dig the pool deeper to ensure it did not run dry. In return, the ranchers would help repair the fence and respect the boundary in the future. One of the ranchers, a hard-faced man named Jedson, spat on the ground. "I do not make deals with savages." Atsidi's eyes hardened, but his voice remained steady. "A thirsty man is not a savage. A man who lets his animals die of thirst when there is water nearby is a fool. Which are you?" For a long moment, no one moved. The heat, the dust, and the tension were suffocating. Then the other rancher, a younger man, lowered his rifle. "He is right. Jetson, we need the water." The crisis was averted. Atsidi's leadership had turned a certain bloodbath into a grudging, temporary truce. Watching him, Eliza understood the meaning of Hozo. It was not a passive state, but an active, difficult pursuit of harmony in a broken world. It was a strength far greater than brute force. The incident, however, gave Deputy Boone the ammunition he needed. The story, when it reached his ears, was twisted into an account of an armed uprising. The Navajo had threatened peaceful ranchers, led by the wanted man, Atsidi Nez, and who was there? In the middle of it all, the schoolteacher, Eliza Hart. The next day, Boone nailed a new notice to the board. It was a warrant for Eliza's arrest. The charge was inciting a riot and conspiring with a known fugitive. It was a declaration of war. Mrs. Lujan rushed to Eliza's house, her face pale. "You must leave," she urged. "They will not give you a fair hearing. They will lock you up and throw away the key." Eliza knew she was right. Her presence in Dry Willow was no longer a help to anyone. It was a liability. Panic began to rise in her throat, cold and suffocating. Where could she go? As if in answer to her unspoken question, a soft scratching sound came from her back door. She opened it to find Abel Martinez standing in the deep shadows of the evening. "He sent me," the boy whispered. "He said it is not safe. He is waiting for you at the split rock. I am to guide you." There was no time to pack, no time for goodbyes. Eliza grabbed her medical bag and the deerskin pouch of herbs, a talisman against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She followed Abel out into the night, away from the life she had tried to build, and into the vast, unknown wilderness of the canyons. Atsidi was waiting for her, a silent figure in the moonlight, ready to lead her into hiding. The world shrank to the size of a hidden canyon. For Eliza, life became a rhythm of rock, sun, and shadow. Atsidi led her to a place the Daine called the Whispering Gallery, a series of interconnected caves and ledges high up on a sheer cliff face, accessible only by a series of handholds carved into the rock centuries ago. From here, they could see for miles, but they themselves were invisible. Days were measured by the movement of the sun across the sky. Atsidi taught her things she never would have learned in a book. He showed her how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, which plants could be eaten and which could heal. He spoke little, but his silence was companionable, a shared space rather than an empty one. She learned the language of his movements, the slight tilt of his head that meant he was listening to a distant sound, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at the vast expanse of the land he called home. She, in turn, offered him what she could. She tended to the cuts and scrapes he acquired on his solitary patrols of the area. She read to him sometimes from the single book she had managed to grab, a collection of poems that felt both foolish and essential in this raw, untamed place. He would listen, his expression unreadable, and she wondered what he made of the rhyming words and structured verses that were so different from the chanted stories of his own people. A fragile trust grew between them, nurtured by the shared isolation and the constant low-level threat of discovery. Yet a space remained between them, a canyon of culture, experience, and the unspoken prejudices she had carried with her whole life without even realizing it. She saw him as a man, a good and honorable one. But a part of her still saw him through the lens of dry willow, as the other, the fugitive, the Navajo. One afternoon, while searching for firewood along a lower ledge, her foot slipped on a patch of loose shale. She fell, sliding a few feet down a steep incline, her arm scraping against the rough sandstone. It was not a serious injury, but a long, angry scratch that oozed blood. When she returned to their small, sheltered camp, Atsidi cleaned the wound with a practiced hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. He applied a poultice of crushed leaves that immediately soothed the stinging. "There is a spring, a day's walk from here," he said, his voice low. "The water is clean. It will help prevent infection." The next day, she followed him along a barely discernible trail that snaked through the labyrinthine canyons. The heat was intense, reflecting off the rock walls. By the time they reached the hidden spring, she was coated in a fine layer of red dust, her clothes sticking to her skin. The spring was a miracle, a trickle of clear, cold water emerging from a fissure in the rock, pooling in a series of shallow basins before disappearing back into the sand. It was a secret place, green with moss and ferns, a pocket of impossible life in the middle of the desolation. Atsidi indicated that he was going to scout the upper rim of the small canyon. "Stay here," he said. "Rest. The water is safe." She watched him scale the rock face with an effortless agility that still amazed her. Left alone in the quiet sanctuary, Eliza felt a desperate need to wash away the grime of the last few weeks. She looked around. The place felt utterly secluded, shielded from the rest of the world. She took the canteen to fill it, then set it aside. The cool water of the pool was too tempting. She followed a small path downstream, around a large outcropping of rock that hid the next section of the spring from view. She wanted a moment of privacy, to feel clean, to feel like herself again. As she rounded the boulder, she froze. He was there. Atsidi stood in a waist-deep pool, the clear water swirling around him. He had evidently returned from his patrol and, like her, had sought the relief of the spring. His back was to her, the muscles moving smoothly under his skin as he sluiced water over his head and shoulders. A hot flush of embarrassment washed over her. She made a small, involuntary sound, and he turned. His body was lean and strong, scarred in places, a testament to a life of conflict and survival. But it was his face, his eyes, that held her. There was no surprise in them, no anger, no shame. There was only a profound and unshakable calm. She found the Navajo warrior bathing by accident. His calm words and steady gaze changed her forever. Eliza spun around, her face burning, her back rigid. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. I will come back later," she stammered to the rock wall in front of her. She heard the soft splash of water as he moved. A moment later, his voice came, as calm and steady as his gaze had been. "The water is enough for two who know respect." His words were not a suggestion, but a statement of fact, a simple truth that cut through her mortification. He was not embarrassed. He was not offended. He was treating the situation with a dignity that made her own flustered reaction feel childish. Slowly, she turned back around. He had wrapped a woven blanket around his waist and was standing on the bank, his hair dripping onto his shoulders. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips, enough to wash away a few prejudices. "Perhaps," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He did not smile back, but the intensity in his eyes softened. He simply nodded, a gesture of complete understanding. In that moment, the final barrier between them dissolved. He was not the other. He was a man, and he had just granted her a level of respect and equality that few men of her own race ever had. It was not his nakedness that had changed things, but the utter lack of artifice, the profound self-possession that clothed him more completely than any suit of clothes ever could. Later, as they sat in the shade, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was Eliza who finally broke it. "The smallpox took my husband," she said, the words coming out before she had even consciously decided to speak them. "It was 2 years ago. He was a doctor. He worked until he could not stand, and then he lay down and was gone. I came out here to build a life he would have been proud of, one where I chose my own way." Atsidi listened, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and laced with a pain that time had not healed. "My older brother was killed by a patrol from the fort," he said. "They said he was a raider. He was a shepherd. He was bringing a lost lamb back to the flock. They did not ask questions. They saw his brown skin, and they shot him." He touched the silver necklace at his throat. "This was his. I wear it to remember that the law of the white man is not always the law of justice." They shared their grief in the quiet of the hidden spring. Two people from different worlds, bound together by loss and by a shared search for a place to be whole. The unspoken things between them were finally given voice, and their fragile alliance was forged into something stronger, something that felt like the beginning of a true understanding. Their precarious peace was shattered a week later when Abel Martinez found his way to their hiding place. He brought with him a small supply of cornmeal and jerky, and a heavy dose of bad news from Dry Willow. "They are saying terrible things." "Eliza," he said, his young face troubled, "Deputy Boone tells everyone in the saloon that you have run off to live with the Navajo, that you are Atsidi's woman. He is using it to stir up more anger. He says you have betrayed your own kind." Eliza felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Kincaid and Boone were not just trying to discredit her. They were trying to erase her, to turn her into a cautionary tale, a fallen woman beyond the protection of her own society. "They are liars," Atsidi said, his voice flat and hard. "We know that," Eliza said, her mind racing. But the people in town will believe it. We have to fight back with the truth. She made a decision. Abel, I need you to do something for me. I am going to write a letter to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe. I will include a sworn statement about the attack in the canyon and a copy of my logbook entry about your accident. It proves that Atsidis people were not near the fire. I need you to take it to the post office and send it. It was a desperate gamble, a single piece of paper against a mountain of lies. But it was the only weapon she had. Abel agreed without hesitation. She spent the evening carefully drafting the letter, her words precise and clear. The next morning, Abel took the precious document and disappeared back into the canyons. They waited for days, the anxiety a constant, gnawing presence. Finally, Abel returned. The look on his face told them everything before he even spoke. "The letter is gone," he said, his voice choked with frustration. "Someone broke into the post office 2 nights ago. They did not take much money, just a few mailbags. The one bound for Santa Fe was one of them." He looked down at the ground. The postmaster found tracks outside. Boot prints. The same kind the miners who work for Kincaid wear. The news of the stolen letter fell upon their small sanctuary like a stone, sinking them into a grim silence. Their one lifeline to the outside world, to a justice that might exist beyond the borders of Dry Willow, had been cut. Kincaid had not just sealed them off, he had made them ghosts. Their truths and pleas scattered to the wind like so much dust. The days that followed were heavy with an unspoken despair. They were trapped, hunted, and now silenced. The sky began to change. The endless, placid blue was replaced by a sickly yellow haze that clung to the horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange energy. Atsidi watched the sky, his face carved from stone, his eyes missing nothing. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice a low rumble, not of rain, but of earth. "We must go to the lower camp. My family will need to be moved to the deep caves." They descended from the high ledges, a journey that now felt familiar to Eliza, and made their way to the hidden dine camp. The mood there was already one of quiet urgency. The women were gathering children and securing what few belongings they could. The air was so thick you could taste the grit in it, a fine powder that coated the tongue and stung the eyes. Nali Yazi, now fully recovered, greeted Eliza with a warm embrace. "Mrs." Luhan was there too, having come to deliver some medicinal herbs, and now found herself caught in the path of the coming tempest. The first gust of wind was a physical blow, a solid wall of air that stole the breath and sent sand swirling in angry eddies. The sun vanished, swallowed by a roiling, brown cloud that consumed the sky. Day turned into a suffocating twilight. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging sand. "We must go now," Atsidi shouted over the roar. "To the caves of the ancestors. Everyone, hold on to the rope." He produced a long coil of braided leather. He was the anchor, leading the way into the blinding chaos. The small group of women, children, and elders formed a human chain behind him, their hands clutching the lifeline. Eliza found herself in the middle, a small, crying boy clinging to one of her hands, the rough leather of the rope in the other. The sand was a physical presence, a living thing that tore at their skin and clothes, forcing its way into their eyes, noses, and mouths. Vision was reduced to a few feet of swirling brown. To let go of the rope was to be lost, swallowed by the storm in an instant. They moved as one organism, a fragile chain of humanity against the raw power of nature. The children were terrified, their whimpers lost in the gale. Fear was a palpable thing. A cold knot in Eliza's stomach. She could feel the panic of the woman behind her, the trembling of the small boy beside her. In the midst of the terror, she heard a grunt of frustration. It was Mrs. Luhan, who was stubbornly clutching a small wooden bowl covered with a cloth. Even now, The practical old woman was trying to protect the mesa she had been preparing for tortillas. "This dust has no respect," she yelled, her voice a reedy shout against the wind's fury. "It will get into the flour, and then the tortillas will have more grit than a sheriff's conscience." A small, choked laugh escaped from one of the older women. A boy, hearing the absurdity of the complaint, let out a giggle that was half a sob. The moment of shared, ridiculous humanity broke the spell of terror. It was a reminder that even in the heart of a world gone mad, life, with its small, stubborn concerns, went on. They were not just victims of a storm. They were people, and they would get through this. It was then that the other threat revealed itself. Figures emerged from the brown gloom, indistinct and menacing. It was Deputy Boone and a half-dozen of Kincaid's men, their face wrapped in bandanas. They used the storm as cover, expecting to find the Dine camp abandoned or its people too disoriented to resist. Boone raised his pistol, his voice a distorted bellow. "This is our water now. Get off this land." Atsidi did not hesitate. He pushed the woman behind him back, his voice a sharp command. "Get the children to the cave entrance. Now!" He did not draw his rifle to kill. That was not his way. He was a protector, not a murderer. From a pouch at his belt, he pulled a small, flat stone and his slingshot. The stone flew, a dark blur in the storm, and struck the pistol in Boone's hand with a sharp crack, sending it spinning into the sand. One of Kincaid's men, startled and unnerved by the sudden resistance, fired his rifle wildly into the swirling dust. A child near Eliza stumbled and fell. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, covering the boy's small body with her own. She felt a searing, white-hot pain slice across her ribs, as if a hot poker had been laid against her skin. The bullet had grazed her, tearing through her dress and the flesh beneath. Atsidi's rifle was at his shoulder now, but he did not aim at the men. He fired once, into the rock face high above them. The shot, amplified and distorted by the wind, sounded like a cannon blast, echoing from multiple directions at once. It was a warning, a show of force designed to confuse and intimidate. To Boone's men, lost in the disorienting roar of the storm, it sounded as if they were surrounded. They hesitated, their bravado swallowed by the chaos. Atsidi used their confusion, shoving his people toward the narrow crevice that marked the cave's entrance. Once inside, they collapsed, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from cold and fear. The roar of the storm was muffled now, a distant, angry beast. In the dim light, Nolly saw the dark stain spreading across the side of Eliza's dress. She gently helped Eliza sit, her face a mask of concern. The wound was shallow, a long, ugly gash, but it was bleeding freely. Nolly cleaned it with water from a skin and packed it with herbs, her touch firm and reassuring. As the afternoon wore on, the storm raged outside, a relentless assault. The children, huddled together, were still frightened. Nolly sat among them and began to sing. It was a lullaby, a soft, chanting melody that rose and fell like a gentle breath. The words were in a language Eliza did not understand, but the meaning was universal. It spoke of safety, of a mother's love, of the stars that would return after the storm passed. The simple, ancient song was a balm, a thread of culture and comfort woven into the heart of the chaos. Eliza closed her eyes, the pain in her side a dull throb, and let the music wash over her, a seed of a different world planting itself in her soul. The wind finally died down as night fell. The following morning, the world was remade. The sky was a bruised purple, and a thick blanket of red sand covered everything, smoothing sharp edges and creating strange, new dunes. The air was still and eerily quiet. Their first need was fresh, clean water. Atsidi and Eliza left the relative safety of the cave and made their way toward the Salt Cedar Creek. The landscape was almost unrecognizable, the familiar paths erased. When they finally reached the creek bed, they stopped, a shared sense of disbelief and dread washing over them. The water was no longer the clear, life-giving stream they knew. It was a turgid, muddy slurry, the color of coffee and clay. It was thick with silt, undrinkable. The sabotage was not just on paper anymore. Atsidi moved upstream, his eyes scanning the banks. Eliza followed, her hand pressed against her bandaged side. A few hundred yards from the dine camp, they found it. A crude diversion ditch had been dug, cutting across a narrow bend in the creek. Fresh shovel marks, though blurred by the storm, were still visible in the damp earth. The ditch siphoned off the bulk of the clean water, redirecting it toward the valley now claimed by Silas Kincaid. Only a muddy, useless trickle was left to flow down the original creek bed. The attack during the storm had been a feint, a violent distraction. While Boone and his men had played the part of raiders, another team had been at work, stealing the water itself, the very lifeblood of the Salt Cedar Valley. Their crime was no longer just a matter of forged signatures and stolen letters. It was carved into the earth itself. The muddy water of Salt Cedar Creek was more than a crime. It was a desecration. It was a physical manifestation of Kincaid's greed, a slow, brown poison seeping into the heart of the valley. For Eliza and Atsidi, standing on the ruined bank, the sight extinguished the last flicker of hope that this conflict could be resolved by appeals to reason or law. The law had been bought, and reason had been shouted down. What was left was the earth itself, wounded and bleeding. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. The discovery of the diversion ditch became a catalyst, a turning point that shifted them from a posture of defense to one of active opposition. They could no longer hide and wait. They had to uncover the full scope of Kincaid's crimes and bring them into the light, not for a distant magistrate, but for the people of Dry Willow themselves. The change began with Abel. The boy was consumed by a quiet fury. His youthful admiration for Atsidi now forged into a fierce loyalty. He refused to stand by while his family's land was stolen and his friends were hunted. He had a plan, a reckless one, born of a boy's courage. He knew Kincaid kept his business ledgers in a small office at the back of the mercantile. While the front of the store was always busy, the back was often empty in the late afternoon. Abel had seen the delivery men come and go. He knew the layout. He would get inside. Eliza and Atsidi argued against it. The risk was too great. But Abel was resolute. He knew the back alleys and shadows of Dry Willow better than anyone. He would not be seen. Before they could stop him, he was gone, a ghost slipping back towards the town that had exiled them. They endured 2 days of agonizing silence. Every sound in the canyon, every passing bird, made Eliza's heart leap into her throat. On the evening of the second day, Abel returned. He was pale and his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned with triumph. Under his shirt, he carried a thin, leather-bound ledger. They examined it by the light of a small, smokeless fire. The book was a meticulous record of Kincaid's finances, and it told a damning story. There were regular, disguised payments to Deputy Boone, listed under security consultation. There were entries detailing the purchase of blasting powder and fuses. Most chillingly, there was a large payment to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency for asset protection services. Kincaid was no longer relying on local thugs. He had hired professionals, men known for their ruthless efficiency. The ledger was the stone-cold proof that tied Kincaid, Boone, the fire, and the stolen water all together. While Abel had been risking his life, Eliza had gambled on a different front. She had convinced Mrs. Luhan to arrange a secret meeting with Old Man Crowley. They met in a root cellar behind the cantina, the air thick with the smell of earth and tequila. Crowley was a nervous wreck, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a sweaty fear. "I did not want any trouble," he stammered, wiping his brow with a grimy handkerchief. "Kincaid is a powerful man." "He is a thief," Eliza said, her voice low and steady. "And his theft is going to dry up this entire town. Your saloon included. No water means no ranchers, no miners, no customers." Her words hit their mark. Crowley was a man motivated by coin, and he could see his livelihood evaporating. His loyalty to Kincaid was only as deep as his pockets. "I saw them," he finally confessed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The night before Kincaid posted that notice. 2 of his men, they were out by the valley entrance with a mule. They pulled up the old boundary marker and moved it a quarter-mile east. I was coming back late. I saw the whole thing." The confession was another piece of the puzzle. Now they needed the final one, the forgery. Eliza remembered a family, the Pritchards, who had a small homestead near the new false boundary. They were a quiet couple who kept to themselves. Mr. Pritchard was a man known to be easily intimidated. She sent a message with a trusted wagoner, a simple request for some of her herbal remedies, a pretext for a meeting. She met Martha Pritchard in a secluded arroyo. The woman was terrified, her hands twisting in her apron. Her husband, she explained, had been the one forced to sign the false witness document that legitimized Kincaid's claim. "Boone came to the house," she said, her voice trembling. "He said our deed had irregularities, that he could have us thrown off our land in a week. But if my husband signed this other paper, just as a formality, he would make sure our claim was secure. It was a lie. He threatened us. What were we supposed to do?" They now had all the financial records, the eyewitness to the boundary fraud, and the testimony of the coerced witness. They had the truth. The question was what to do with it. The knowledge was a heavy, dangerous weight. "If we release this, Kincaid will not run," Eliza said to Atsidi as they sat by the fire that night, the stolen ledger between them. "He will fight. He will send Boone and those Pinkertons after your people. There will be a bloodbath." Her own near miss with the bullet during the sandstorm was a fresh, aching memory. The thought of bringing that level of violence down on Nolly and the children was unbearable. Atsidi stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "For my whole life, I have watched them they take the land, they take the water, they take our dignity. If we do nothing, they will continue to take until there is nothing left. The truth must be spoken." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "But you are right. Hosho is about balance. There is no harmony in the slaughter of innocents. Justice cannot be bought with the blood of my family." His internal battle was plain to see the warriors' desire for retribution against the leader's responsibility to protect. Out of their shared dilemma, a plan was born, a strategy with 2 distinct fronts, as different as fire and water. The first front would be public. The annual Dry Willow Town Festival was in a week. It was the one time all the ranchers, miners, and townsfolk would be gathered in one place. It was a day of celebration, a perfect stage for a dramatic revelation. They would expose Kincaid in front of the very people he sought to control. The second front was silent and immediate. Atsidi had seen Kincaid's men working on a small, secondary dam structure upriver from the illegal diversion. It was not the main dam Kincaid planned to build, but a smaller one, designed to manage the flow into his new channel. It was where they were storing the blasting powder from the ledger. If they could disable the explosives and sabotage the diversion dam's main sluice gate, they could restore the majority of the water to the Salt Cedar Creek. It would be a tangible victory, an act of restorative justice that would happen before the public confrontation. They forged their plan into a principle, a rule of engagement spoken aloud in the quiet of the canyon. "No killing," Eliza said, her voice firm. Atsidi nodded in agreement. "We save the water first, we reveal the truth second." It was a pact, a promise made between 2 worlds, the teacher and the warrior, united by a single purpose. They spent the next few days in careful preparation, planning every detail, every contingency. Abel became their eyes and ears in town, reporting on the festival preparations and the movements of Kincaid's men. He was their vital link, a brave boy playing a man's game. On the evening before he was to make his final report, Abel was more confident than ever. He had found the storage shed where the Pinkertons kept their supplies, away from the main town. He believed he could get close enough to see how many guards were posted there at night. This information was crucial for Atsidi's plan to sabotage the dam. He slipped away as twilight bled across the desert. Eliza and Atsidi waited. The moon rose, a silver sliver in the dark sky. Hours passed. The quiet of the canyon began to feel heavy, oppressive. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, began to creep into Eliza's heart. He should have been back by now. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, the scuff of a boot on rock. From the trail below, it was not Abel's light. Quick step, these were heavy, deliberate footsteps. Two men appeared, their faces grim in the moonlight. They were not Kincaid's usual thugs. They moved with a cold professionalism, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They were Pinkertons. Between them, his arms pinned behind his back, was Abel. His face was bruised, and a small trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. He looked up at Eliza and at Atsidi, his eyes wide with fear and a boy's terrible shame at having been caught. One of the agents looked up at their ledge, a cold smile on his face. "Silas Kincaid sends his regards," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He believes you have something that belongs to him." The trade was made at dusk, in a narrow chasm where the shadows grew long and black. The two Pinkerton agents stood on one side of a dry wash, holding Abel between them. On the other side stood Atsidi, a lone, still figure against the darkening rock. Eliza waited 20 yards behind him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She held the ledger. "The book for the boy," the lead agent called out, his voice flat. "No tricks." "You have my word," Eliza answered, her voice clear and steady. "And we have yours, that you will let him go unharmed." The agent offered a humorless smile. "Our word is as good as our client's payment." Eliza walked forward and placed the ledger on a flat rock in the center of the wash. She retreated, her eyes never leaving Abel's pale face. One of the agents pushed the boy forward, and he stumbled across the loose gravel toward them. As soon as Abel was safely behind Atsidi, the second agent retrieved the book. "Mr. Kincaid asked me to deliver a message," the lead agent said, his voice carrying in the still air. "He knows your plans for the festival. He wants you to know it will be your last day of freedom. Enjoy it." They melted back into the shadows, their departure as silent and professional as their arrival. Atsidi placed a hand on Abel's shoulder, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. The boy was shaken but unharmed. Their proof was gone, but the boy was safe. The deal had been made, and the deadline had been set. The day of the Dry Willow Festival dawned bright and hot. From their hidden vantage point, they could hear the faint sounds of celebration drifting up from the town, the cheerful, frantic sawing of a fiddle, the crack of rifles at a target shooting contest, the distant shouts and laughter of a crowd determined to forget the drought and the tension for just one day. The town square was a swirl of color and life. Women wore their best calico dresses, bright ribbons braided into their hair. Ranchers who had not seen each other in months slapped each other on the back, their talk of cattle and water prices momentarily forgotten. The air smelled of roasted corn, horse sweat, and the ever-present dust, now kicked up by dancing feet. It was a picture of vibrant, tenacious life, a community clinging to its traditions in the face of hardship. But underneath the forced gaiety, the tension was a coiled spring. Deputy Boone swaggered through the crowd, a holstered pistol on each hip, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. Kincaid's Pinkertons were visible but discreet, leaning against porch posts, their faces impassive, their presence a cold reminder of where the real power lay. Silas Kincaid himself presided over the festivities from a large tent set up in the center of the square, a benevolent patriarch bestowing gifts and smiles, his ledger now safely back in his possession. Their plan, once a calculated strategy, was now a desperate, two-pronged gamble. The first part fell to Atsidi, he and two of his most trusted warriors, men who moved as silently as he did, had slipped away before dawn. Their target was the secondary dam upriver and the cache of explosives stored there. They were not going to destroy the dam, but to perform a delicate surgery. They had to get past the Pinkerton guards, locate the blasting caps for the main charges, and disable them. Then they had to sabotage the main sluice gate, the mechanism that diverted the water into Kincaid's channel. Their goal was to cripple the illegal operation and restore the creek's natural flow, all without being seen. It was a mission that required absolute stealth and precision. A single mistake, a single misplaced footstep, would mean discovery and death. The second part of the plan belonged to Eliza. She had to walk directly into the lion's den, though they no longer had the ledger. She knew its contents by heart, but accusations were not enough. She needed one final piece of irrefutable proof. She needed a sample of Kincaid's real handwriting, a signature, a note, anything that she could compare to the forged signature on the land grant documents, a copy of which Mrs. Luhan still possessed. She entered the town not as a fugitive, but as a woman attending a festival. A simple bonnet hid her hair, and a borrowed shawl changed the line of her shoulders. She kept to the edges of the crowd, her eyes fixed on Kincaid's large canvas tent. It served as his mobile office, the nerve center of his operations. Mrs. Luhan was her diversion. The old woman, a master of chaotic theater, had set up a small stand selling fresh, hot fritters. At a prearranged signal from Eliza, a slight nod of the head, Mrs. Luhan went into action. As two of the Pinkerton guards passed her stand, she feigned a stumble, sending a tray of sizzling, sugar-dusted pastries flying. The fritters landed on the chest of one of the agents, a man with a notoriously short temper. "Hey, my beautiful fritters, Mrs." Luhan wailed, launching into a loud and dramatic lament in a mix of Spanish and English. "You clumsy ox, you have murdered my little pillows of joy. Look at them, lying there in the dirt. Do you have any idea the work that goes into such perfection?" A crowd instantly gathered, drawn by the spectacle of the small, fierce midwife berating the large and embarrassed agent who was frantically trying to wipe the hot grease and melted sugar from his shirt. It was the perfect distraction, while all eyes were on Mrs. Luhan's performance. Eliza slipped around the back of Kincaid's tent. The rear flap was unguarded. She lifted it and slid inside. The tent was sparsely furnished a field desk, a chair, and a locked metal box. On the desk, held down by a glass paperweight, was a bill of lading for a recent shipment of mining equipment, and at the bottom, in bold, confident strokes, was the signature she was looking for Silas Kincaid. It was nothing like the cramped, careful signature on the land documents. She heard a voice just outside the tent. Her heart leaped into her throat. She quickly folded the paper, tucked it into the bodice of her dress, and slipped back out the rear flap just as a guard entered through the front to investigate the commotion. As she melted back into the crowd, the final part of the day's events was beginning. A temporary wooden stage had been erected in the square for the speeches and awards. Kincaid, flanked by Deputy Boone, took the stage. He held up his hands for silence, his face a mask of civic concern. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "It is a day for celebration, but we cannot celebrate while a threat hangs over our community, a threat of violence and lawlessness, instigated by the fugitive at Sidi Nez." As if on cue, a man was pushed from the crowd onto the stage. He was a drifter Eliza had seen around town. His eyes were shifty, and he reeked of cheap whiskey. "This man," Kincaid declared, "was a witness. Tell them what you saw, my good man." The drifter cleared his throat. "I saw him," he said, pointing a trembling finger in the direction of the canyons. "That Navajo, at Sidi. I saw him with a torch, the night the Martinez barn burned. He did it. He set the fire." A low, angry murmur rippled through the crowd. Boone stepped forward, his hand on his pistol. "The time for talking is over, as deputy of this territory. I am officially calling for a posse to hunt down this criminal and his accomplice, Eliza Hart, and bring them to justice." The crowd was turning, the festive mood curdling into a mob mentality. But before the first man could volunteer, another voice cut through the air, thin but clear. "He is lying." All heads turned. Pushing his way slowly through the crowd was Old Man Crowley, the saloon keeper, his face pale with sweat, climbed the steps to the stage. He looked not at the crowd, but directly at Kincaid. "I keep my mouth shut about most things," Crowley said, his voice shaking but determined. "It is good for business, but a town with no water is a town with no business at all." He turned to the crowd. "I saw Kincaid's men. In the middle of the night, they moved the boundary markers for the Salt Cedar Valley. They stole that land, just as sure as if they had picked your pocket." A stunned silence fell over the square. Kincaid's face, for the first time, lost its composure, his eyes flashing with fury. Before he could respond, Eliza stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. All her fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. "He is telling the truth," she said, her voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. She held up the bill of lading she had taken from the tent. "This is Silas Kincaid's signature, and I have a copy of the land grant he filed. The signatures do not match. He forged the document that gives him claim to the water." The crowd was a sea of confused and angry faces. Their loyalties suddenly split. Some yelled in support of Kincaid. Others shouted for Eliza. The town was a powder keg, and the fuse had been lit. Then, Kincaid played his final, most terrible card. A Pinkerton agent stepped out from the side of the stage. He was not alone. His arm was wrapped around Abel Martinez's neck, the barrel of a pistol pressed firmly against the boy's temple. Abel's face was ashen with terror. The noise of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a collective, horrified gasp. Kincaid's voice was low and cold, stripped of all its previous charm. "The discussion is over. You will hand over the Navajo at CD Nez, or this boy will be the first casualty in a war you cannot possibly win." The world held its breath. The festive music died. The laughter choked in 100 throats. All that remained was the hot sun, the dust, and the cold, black hole of the pistol barrel pressed against Abel's head. Kincaid stood on the stage, a king holding his last, most brutal card, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty. Eliza's mind went blank with terror. This was her fault. She had brought this boy into the line of fire. She took a step forward, her hands raised. "Let him go. Kincaid, this is between you and me." "It is between me and the Navajo," Kincaid corrected, his voice like chipping ice. "Bring him to me, now." A glint of light flashed from the high rocks overlooking the town square. It was sharp and sudden, like a shard of glass catching the sun. The Pinkerton holding Abel flinched, his eyes darting toward the distraction. In that split second of inattention, a voice, low and resonant, echoed from the canyon walls. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let the boy go." It was Atsidi. He was not on the rocks, but standing at the mouth of the alley between the saloon and the mercantile, a place that had been empty a moment before. He stood alone, his rifle held loosely at his side, his body relaxed but poised. He was a part of the landscape, a figure of earth and shadow who had simply willed himself into existence. The Pinkerton agent, recovering his composure, tightened his grip on Abel. One more step and he is dead. Atsidi did not take another step. He simply raised a small, polished piece of silver from the pouch at his belt. He angled it in his hand, catching the afternoon sun. A blinding beam of light shot across the square, striking the agent directly in the eyes. The man cried out, momentarily blinded, his head jerking back. In that instant, Atsidi moved. He was not a man running, he was an arrow released from a bow. He covered the distance to the stage in a blur of motion. He did not attack the blinded agent. He struck the man's wrist with the hard edge of his hand, a sharp, precise blow that sent the pistol flying. He spun, pulling Abel away and shoving him behind the relative safety of a water trough. The second Pinkerton drew his weapon, but a rock, thrown from the roof of the saloon by one of Atsidi's men, struck his shoulder, causing his shot to go wide. Chaos erupted. The crowd surged backward, a wave of screaming panic. Deputy Boone, his face purple with rage and fear, saw his authority, his entire world, collapsing. He saw Eliza standing near the stage, the source of all this ruin. He raised his pistol, his aim wild, his intention murderous. "This is your fault, you interfering witch." He fired. Eliza saw the flash, the puff of smoke, but she did not feel the impact. Atsidi had moved again, a final, desperate lunge that placed his body directly in front of hers. He grunted, a sharp exhalation of breath, and stumbled back a step. A dark red stain blossomed on the shoulder of his buckskin shirt. From the stage, Kincaid saw his plan unraveling. The town was turning against him. His hired guns were neutralized, and his hostage was free. In a final, desperate act of nihilism, he pulled a small detonator from his coat pocket. "If I cannot have the water," he screamed, his voice cracking, "no one will." He slammed his thumb down on the plunger. A deep, subterranean thud shuddered through the ground. It was not the cataclysmic explosion the crowd expected. It was a dull, muffled crump, the sound of a giant beast clearing its throat. All eyes turned upriver, toward the new dam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water came. It was not a destructive wall of force that would have scoured the valley clean, because Atsidi and his men had disabled the main blasting caps. Kincaid's charge had only been powerful enough to rupture the emergency spillway. The water, released from its illegal channel, surged back into its rightful home. It came down the dry bed of the Salt Cedar Creek in a joyous, churning wave, a brown, life-giving torrent that roared with the voice of the land itself. It was not a flood. It was a liberation. The water, the source of all their conflict, had delivered its own verdict. The sight of the returning water broke the spell of fear that had held the town captive. It was a miracle, a tangible sign that the lies were broken. The ranchers at the edge of the crowd, men who had been on the verge of ruin, let out a ragged cheer. Their loyalties had not just shifted, they had returned home, to the truth of the land and the water. In the midst of the cheering, Eliza had eyes only for Atsidi. She rushed to his side, tearing a strip of cloth from her petticoat. She pressed it against the wound on his shoulder, her hands trembling. Blood, warm and slick, soaked the fabric. "It is not deep," he said, his voice tight with pain, but his eyes were what she remembered from the hidden spring. They were steady, calm, and fixed on her face. In the midst of the chaos, the gunshots, and the roar of the water, he was her anchor, her center. Their connection forged in secrecy and confirmed in that moment of shared vulnerability was now sealed in blood and sacrifice. The momentum was irreversible. The crowd, emboldened by the return of the water and Crowley's confession, surged forward, their anger now focused and directed. They surrounded the stage, a wall of determined faces. Eliza stood and faced Kincaid, her voice clear and ringing, carrying over the noise. "You have lost, Kincaid. We have your forged signature. We have the testimony of the man you threatened. We know about the payments to Boone and the Pinkertons from the ledger you thought you recovered. It is over." Kincaid looked out at the sea of faces that had, only an hour before, been his subjects. He saw no fear, no deference. He saw only judgment. His reign was over. Deputy Boone, ever the coward, saw his chance to escape. He scrambled off the back of the stage and tried to flee into the chaos. He did not get far. A figure blocked his path, small but immovable. It was Mrs. Luhan. She held the large, flat wooden shovel she used to slide fritters into the hot oil. With a grunt of profound satisfaction, she swung it like a cricket bat. It connected with Boone's face with a comical thwack, covering him in a cloud of flour and sugar. He stumbled backward, blinded and sputtering. Before he could recover, Atsidi was on him. With his one good arm, he grabbed Boone's collar and used a simple, elegant leg sweep to bring the larger man crashing to the ground. He knelt, pressing his knee into the deputy's back, his wounded shoulders screaming in protest, but his movements were sure. The fight was over. Several ranchers, their faces grim, took Kincaid into custody, binding his hands behind his back. The Pinkertons, seeing their employer defeated and the entire town united against them, quietly holstered their weapons and melted into the crowd. Their contract effectively terminated. Someone ripped the wanted poster for Atsidi from the notice board and tore it into pieces, letting the scraps flutter away in the breeze. The spontaneous act was an unofficial pardon, an immediate restoration of justice by the people themselves. The dust of the festival did not settle for a long time, but it was a different kind of dust. It was the dust of a world being remade, stirred up not by conflict, but by the slow, deliberate work of healing. The arrival of 2 federal marshals a week later, their badges gleaming in the sun, was a quiet and sober affair. They came not with guns drawn, but with law books and a mandate to investigate. The town of Dry Willow, which had lived so long under the thumb of a single man's will, found itself telling its story to impartial ears. Affidavits were taken, testimonies were heard, and the careful web of lies that Silas Kincaid had woven was unraveled thread by thread. Mrs. Lujan, her command of the English language suddenly and miraculously precise, recounted the tale of the forged signature. Old man Crowley, his voice gaining strength with every word, described the moving of the boundary markers. Martha Pritchard, her fear finally eclipsed by her courage, told of Deputy Boone's threats, and Eliza, her testimony clear and unwavering, presented the final, damning pieces of the puzzle. The trial was held not in Dry Willow, but in Santa Fe, far from Kincaid's influence. The federal court declared his land and water grants fraudulent, null, and void. The rights to the Salt Cedar Creek were officially returned to the public trust, to be shared by all the inhabitants of the valley, as they had been for generations. The law, which had been twisted into a weapon of oppression, was finally straightened and made to serve justice. The fate of Silas Kincaid was not the simple, brutal end that many in the town had secretly hoped for. There was no hangman's noose, no swift frontier justice. The federal court, in a ruling that was both merciful and wise, sentenced him not to death, but to a different kind of demise. His wealth was stripped from him. His assets were seized and liquidated. He was ordered to pay a lifetime of restitution. His remaining funds channeled into 2 specific projects, a community water management fund and the establishment of a proper schoolhouse and clinic in Dry Willow. It was a practical, restorative justice. The wealth he had accumulated by threatening the town's future would now be used to secure it. He was left a man with nothing but his own impotent rage, a ghost of the power he once wielded. With the legal storm past, a quiet but profound change settled over the valley. The line between Dry Willow and the Dine Camp, once a chasm of suspicion, began to blur. The shared threat and the shared victory had forged a new, fragile understanding. People began to see each other not as categories, but as neighbors. Eliza's dream took root in the newly fertile soil of the community. With funds from the restitution, and with lumber and labor donated by ranchers who now had water for their cattle and their futures. The schoolhouse was built. It was a simple, sturdy structure with large windows that let in the bright desert light. It was a place for everyone. The children of the Anglo ranchers sat beside the Martinez children, and soon, a few of the younger Dine children began to attend, their initial shyness giving way to a fierce curiosity. Eliza taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also learned from them, picking up a few words of Spanish and the names of the Dine clans. Her small adobe house became the clinic she had envisioned, a place where she stitched cuts, dispensed quinine, and offered a listening ear. The unofficial heart of the town's well-being. At CD, his name now cleared and his reputation transformed from fugitive to hero, found a new purpose as well. The very skills that had made him a formidable warrior, his deep knowledge of the land, his calm demeanor, his ability to see the truth of a situation now made him an indispensable peacekeeper. He became a guide, a negotiator, a bridge between the two cultures. When a rancher's cattle strayed onto Ding grazing land, it was Atsidi who mediated the dispute, his voice of quiet reason preventing a new conflict before it could begin. He walked in both worlds, respected in both, helping to weave the frayed edges of the community back together. The seasons turned. The wound on Atsidi's shoulder healed, leaving a puckered, silvery scar. The creek, its flow restored, ran clear and steady. The valley began to breathe again, a long, slow sigh of relief. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the canyon rims, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, Eliza and Atsidi walked along the bank of the Salt Cedar Creek. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the gentle murmur of the water and the distant cry of a hawk. They walked in a comfortable silence, their shared past a foundation that needed no words. He stopped and looked out at the water, his profile etched against the vibrant sky. Eliza stopped beside him. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the scar on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he had endured for her. He did not flinch, but stood perfectly still, accepting her touch. "That day at the spring," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the evening air. "You taught me that peace has a voice." A slow smile touched Atsidi's lips, a rare and beautiful thing that transformed his usually stoic face. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes full of a warmth that mirrored the setting sun. "And you heard it," he answered. The space between them vanished. He wrapped his arms around her, his one good arm and the one that still carried the memory of the bullet. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, her own arms circling his waist. It was a long, quiet embrace, full of an unspoken understanding that was more profound than any declaration. It was not the embrace of passion, but of homecoming. It was the quiet, certain click of two disparate pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was choice. The silver necklace he always wore, once a symbol of a brother lost to injustice, now rested against her cheek. It no longer felt like just a token of grief. It felt like a promise, a circle of trust and continuity. It was the promise not of forever, but of the present, the choice they had made and would continue to make each day, as simple and as necessary as drawing water from the creek. They talked, their voices low, of the future, not of grand plans, but of small, tangible things. "The school will need a new roof before the winter rains," she said. "I know a place where the piñon grows thick and straight," he replied. "We can cut the beams together." She looked up at him. "We could build a small house, here, near the water." He did not answer immediately, but his arm tightened around her. The idea settled between them, a seed planted in the peaceful evening air. Later that week, Nali came to the schoolhouse. She brought with her a small loom and a bundle of brightly colored yarn. While the children practiced their letters, she began to teach Eliza how to weave, her skilled hands guiding Eliza's clumsy ones. And as they worked, she sang the lullaby Eliza had first heard in the cave during the sandstorm. She taught Eliza the words, their meanings taking root in her heart, another thread weaving their two worlds together. One afternoon, as Eliza stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching the children play in the yard, she heard their laughter. It was a bright, carefree sound, a mix of English, Spanish, and Daine, the sound of a future that had almost been stolen. Atsidi came and stood beside her, and together they watched the children, a shared, silent vision of what they were building, one quiet, deliberate day at a time. A year passed. The wind still blew across the high plains of the New Mexico territory, but it no longer carried the taste of fear and suspicion. It carried the scent of pinon smoke from new hearths, the sound of children's voices from the schoolhouse, and the distant, steady rhythm of hammers building a new world on the foundations of the old one. The seasons cycled through their harsh and beautiful rhythms, and the valley healed. The Salt Cedar Creek, the artery of their shared life, became the symbol of their new covenant. The water, once a source of bitter division, was now a shared responsibility. A council was formed, a simple affair with representatives from the ranchers, the town, and the dine. They met not in an office, but on the banks of the creek itself, Atsidi, with his quiet wisdom, and Abel Martinez's father, with his practical farmer's sense, would sit with the ranchers and discuss the needs of the coming season. There were disagreements, of course. The wind had not scoured away all the old lines of prejudice overnight, but the arguments were now those of neighbors, not enemies. They were hashing out the logistics of survival, not the politics of greed. The community had learned, through fire and thirst, that justice was not a document sealed with wax, but a daily act of listening, of compromise, of seeing the humanity in another's needs. Eliza's school was the valley's new heart. It was a place of boisterous, chaotic life. She taught the children to read from her worn book of poems, but she also taught them the lessons she had learned in the canyons. She taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. She taught them that a community was like a woven blanket. Its strength derived from the interlocking of different threads. Her clinic was a place of physical healing, but also of quiet counsel. People came to her with their fevers and their wounds, but also with their disputes and their sorrows. She had come to this land seeking a life she could choose, and she had found one far richer and more complex than she could ever have imagined. She was no longer just the teacher or the nurse. She was the thread that helped bind the disparate parts of the valley together. The house by the creek was built slowly, deliberately. Atsidi, with two of his cousins, cut and cured the pinon logs. The Martinez family helped to mix the adobe, their hands strong and practiced. Even old man Crowley, in a surprising fit of civic generosity, donated the glass for the two large windows that faced the rising sun. It was a small, solid structure, built of the earth it stood upon. It was not quite in the town, and not quite in the dine camp. It stood in the space between, a home that belonged to both worlds. Their life together was a quiet rhythm of shared tasks and mutual respect. It was in the way he would watch her, a small smile touching his lips, as she struggled to master the intricate patterns on Nali's loom. It was in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he returned, weary and dust-covered, from a long ride tracking a lost calf or guiding a traveler through the high passes. Their love was not a thing of grand pronouncements. It was a choice, renewed each morning with the rising of the sun. It was the freedom to be themselves, together. They learned each other's silences, the comfortable spaces that needed no words, and the quiet moments that spoke volumes. The sandstorm, that terrifying manifestation of nature's rage, became a story, a shared memory that had lost its sharp edges. The fear it had caused had been replaced by the memory of the human chain, of Mrs. Luhan's defiant complaint about the dusty flower, of the lullaby that had been a beacon in the dark. The sky, once cleared of the blinding sand, had remained clear. The prejudices and hatreds that had swirled like that storm had been calmed, not by force, but by the slow, patient work of understanding. The storm had shown them their shared vulnerability, and in that vulnerability, they had found their collective strength. One afternoon, as Atsidi sat outside their new home, carefully polishing the silver necklace his brother had worn, Eliza came and sat beside him. He had added a small, smooth turquoise stone to the chain, its bright blue a striking contrast to the dark, intricate silver. "It is beautiful," she said. "Silver remembers," he said, his voice low. "It remembers the fire and the hands that shaped it. This part," he touched the old, tarnished pendant, "remembers my brother. It remembers the injustice. But this part," he touched the new, bright stone, "this remembers the clear water. It remembers the voice that was heard. A story must have all its parts." He lifted the chain and, with a quiet reverence, placed it around her neck. The cool metal rested against her skin, a circle of trust, a testament to a story that was now theirs to share. That autumn, the town held a new festival. It was not the boisterous, competitive affair of the previous year. It was a harvest festival, a celebration of gratitude. A single, long table was built in the town square, and it groaned under the weight of a shared feast. There were pies from the ranchers' wives, savory stews from the Mexican families, and piles of blue cornbread and roasted mutton from the diney. The celebration began at the creek. Everyone gathered on the banks, a quiet, multi-hued crowd. Atsidi waded into the cool, clear water and filled a clay jar. He brought it to the bank and passed it to a dying elder, who drank from it and passed it on. The jar went from hand to hand, from a small Martinez girl with bright ribbons in her hair, to a grim-faced rancher who had once aimed his rifle in anger, to Mrs. Lujan, who made a theatrical show of inspecting the water's clarity before pronouncing it acceptable. The jar came to Eliza, and she drank, the water cool and sweet, the taste of life itself. She passed it to Atsidi, who was the last to drink. He raised the jar to the sky in a silent gesture of thanks, and then poured the remaining water back onto the earth, completing the circle. Later, as the sun began to set, the community gathered around a large bonfire. Eliza, a circle of children at her feet, read a story not from a book, but from her heart. It was a story about a great storm, and the brave people of all kinds who held on to a rope and found their way to safety, a little distance away. Atsidi had his own group of children. He was not telling them a story, but showing them one. In the soft dust at the edge of the firelight, he drew the tracks of a coyote, a deer, and the tiny, hopping prints of a sparrow. He was teaching them to read the language of the earth, just as surely as Eliza was teaching them to read the language of the page. They were two teachers, two leaders, two halves of a whole they were building together. They did not need to stand side by side to be connected. Their work, their purpose, was intertwined, weaving a future for the valley that was stronger and more resilient than any one culture could have built alone. As the last of the families drifted home, their bellies full and their hearts at peace, Eliza and Atsidi stood once more by the Salt Cedar Creek. The moon was rising, casting a silver path upon the water. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They did not speak of the future or of the past. They simply stood together in the quiet peace of the present, a peace they had earned. In the land of wind, they did not make many promises. They simply chose each other each morning the way one draws water from a spring, calmly, diligently, and with gratitude. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.